So let's first start by highlighting the relevance of the agricultural sector to reaching net zero. About 45% of global soils are under some sort of agricultural use, and according to the FAO, 31% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions originate from the world's agri-food systems. So what most people might not know is that a major source of carbon emissions, and therefore of climate change, are conventional farming practices, such as tilling, that cause the release of soil carbon into the atmosphere. The world's soils may have lost a total 133 billion tons of carbon since humans started farming. So capturing this lost carbon back into the soils would significantly contribute to reaching our net zero goals in a very cost-effective way. This can be implemented through regenerative farming, a nature-based solution that, among many other positive impacts, takes carbon out of the atmosphere and locks it into the soil in the form of organic matter.
Yeah, so when I studied agriculture, actually it's quite amazing. We've just spent so much time talking about carbon. Farmers never talk about carbon. They talk about nitrogen, and we want to get rid of all the nitrogen and the phosphorus. But anyway, but carbon farming is actually key to eliminating the use of ammonium as well as building up the carbon in the soil. And you only have to look back to the Carboniferous period, the age of plants, which has given us coal, ironically, and the plants were fine. We were not around, and the plants were fine. So the big question is, how did these plants manage without clever us to help them with all that nitrogen? And the answer is in mushrooms, fungi. The first plants actually did not have roots. 360 million years ago, there were these green things, and they had fungi to give them all the nutrients. And the little green things took the carbon out of the atmosphere, and through a very inefficient process, actually, called photosynthesis, which has become better, but anyway. And then they produced lots of carbon molecules that fed the fungi, and the fungi gave the plant everything else. 50 million years later, plants said, right, we're going to go it alone, guys. We got roots. You guys can latch onto our roots. You're our plan B, but we're going to manage quite happily by ourselves. And some plants did, but 98% of all the plants today need fungi in order to obtain the nutrients. Now, we come along about 2,000 years ago, and we decide to cultivate. So by cultivating, we slice up all that fungal material. We cut it into little pieces. And it's a dead body lying in the ground, and the bacteria come along and they eat these dead bodies, and the bacteria then produce a sugar rush for the plants in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus and magnesium, blah, 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 and the plants start to grow, but only for a couple of years. So then we have to come along with ammonia, or artificial fertilizers, nitrogen, and we give the plant the equivalent of a bar of chocolate every day. Keep giving chocolate, and the plant starts to feel a bit sick after a while, but it grows. And we have to complete the cycle. We have to keep repeating the cycle. So what we can do in terms of a net zero target is say we can eliminate that nitrogen to zero, and I do mean this. I mean taking nitrogen out of the agricultural sector completely over a period of time, and phosphorus and potassium, and at the same time putting carbon back in the soil. And the way to do it is to use fungi. So a bit like that octopus in the oceans, we need to use the fungi in the soils. And the soils are kind of like the oceans because we know so little about them. But if we think back to that 300 million years of R&D that nature has kindly given us, we can do it. So we go back to carbon farming and enabling farmers not only to make money out of food, we also increase food security because we have resilience, and we have an opportunity to offset carbon.
So the context we find when we look at the agricultural sector is that farmers face a number of pressures. Economic, because prices offered to farmers' produce go down, while fuel, electricity, and inputs prices go up. Resource degradation, especially in terms of soil quality and water access. And social, as rural areas are losing their young to the cities, and farming is not seen as a desirable profession anymore. For instance, the average age of Spanish farmers is 61 years old. Evolving conventional agriculture to adopt regenerative farming practices and soil carbon capture will require more effective incentive schemes and a change in agricultural policies and education. The Australian government, for instance, has already put in place a 15 million Australian dollars program for farmers and landowners to support the implementation and training of soil carbon sequestration. Additionally, counting on cost-effective mechanisms to monitor, measure, and verify soil carbon sequestration will be key. Let's now review the opportunities to create a sustainable business model in Spain based on soil carbon capture.
Yes, so we have, in cultivated areas, I mean, since the Romans, I blame a lot of things on the Romans, but anyway, the Romans came along and started commercial agriculture. And since then, most cultivated soils have lost half their carbon. And this is huge. We're talking large amounts of carbon, hundreds of millions of tons of carbon. So the first thing we have to do is put that back. But we can go further than that. We can actually go further than the land before the Romans, because even before the Romans, we had trees that had been cut down and forest soils that had been degraded. So we can go further than that. And the sums are absolutely enormous. So just looking at the figures, okay, at the moment, agriculture is a net emitter, mainly because of that ammonium that we're going to get rid of, but also because of a lot of fossil fuel that is used in massive farm equipment, which needs to get smaller because we don't need to do any tillage, we don't need to do any deep plowing, all that kind of stuff. We can reduce the horsepower that is used in agricultural machinery and the cost, actually, to the farmers involved. So once you've sorted out that little problem, then you've got this opportunity to actually put back into the ground about 30% of the CO2 emitted since the Industrial Revolution. So huge amounts of CO2 going down back into the soil through something very simple called photosynthesis. Now in Spain, we're looking at, I mean, water is a slightly limiting factor in Spain, but there are other solutions to that. But we've got roughly 17 million hectares of cropland or pasture. So 17 million hectares, so I'm sort of Swiss, so I always think it's about 4 times Switzerland or 3 times Switzerland, and it gives me an idea of what that actually means. So 17 million hectares, and we can capture 2 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare, which actually I think is quite low, but I've been told not to be too ambitious. But so that's what definitely we can do, and we're talking here 3 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year, 15% of Spain's current emissions. So a huge amount of CO2 going into the ground using photosynthesis, which is free, doesn't cost anything. Rubisco, which is the enzyme that controls photosynthesis, actually captures 100 CO2 molecules per second. It's much more efficient than any man-made process. At current EU permit trading prices, Reuters, actually the day before this meeting, it just hit 100 euros a ton of CO2 equivalent. It's been going up for the last few months, but it's just hit 100 euros. So based on that figure, we're talking 3.4 billion euros going into the farming sector per year. Now, my experience of working with farmers is that they really need something above 50 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent in order to get interested in doing this. But you can see there's considerable potential. So not only do we talked about food security. So if you put the carbon back in the soil, you create a much more resilient farming system. So you improve soil aggregation, so you improve infiltration, which is the ability of soil to hold water, which helps deal with a limiting factor in a country like Spain. It's much, much more cost effective. There's no tillage. There's no agricultural chemicals. I mean, zero. There is a transition, but you can get even that thing called glyphosate or Roundup that we don't like, we can eliminate completely. And we maintain yields. We maintain the amount of food, but we also increase the quality of that food at the same time, the nutrient density. Today, you have to eat 8 carrots to get the same nutrients as 1 carrot in the 1900s. So we want to reverse that. We don't need 8 carrots, we just need 1 good carrot. So when one talks about yield depression, well, quality is actually quite important. We capture the rain, better nutrient availability, and actually the farms themselves are generally about 120 euros per hectare more profitable. We found out with these types of practices. So this is stuff that's happening. It's taking place. It's totally proven. It requires thinking back to what nature was doing 300 million years ago. Thinking, wish we could last as long as the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs lasted 150 million years. We've been going for 200,000 so far. Let's see if we can make it as far as the dinosaurs.
As Christopher highlighted before, according to the German Development Agency, by only restoring 50% of already converted lands, we could sequester a 30% of the total CO2 emissions since the Industrial Revolution started. Furthermore, compared to technology-based solutions, after a period of implementation, nature-based solutions are self-sustaining and require minimal intervention or external input. Most importantly, nature-based solutions can be escalated at a low cost, quickly, and over large areas. By contrast, the consequences from farming as usual, or what it is the same, not implementing regenerative agriculture at scale, would be less resilient farms, higher risk and volatility, increased desertification, reduced yields, compromised food safety, increased food prices, increased hunger, and massive forced migration. As Rosa highlighted before, we need to take care of our critical infrastructure or critical assets, and the agricultural sector is a critical asset for any nation or region.
Yeah, just one point on there. So just going back to those Romans, if anybody's been to North Africa recently, there is not much left growing. But North Africa was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire until the Romans started tillage. And that is a very, very graphic evidence of what happens when you start messing about with carbon in the soil.
So in order to articulate and enable large-scale regenerative agriculture and manage the incentive schemes and upfront investment required to make this happen, as Gunther suggested, effective data management will be key. And implementation at scale will require a collaborative approach that could be articulated potentially through a blockchain-based distributed platform, like the one we already mentioned yesterday. A platform that would enable farm-specific guidance to implement soil carbon sequestration, which could be, in a way, automatically calculated through artificial intelligence if we have access to the right data, farmers' access to finance to implement regenerative agriculture and to access the revenues from carbon markets, a platform for the private sector to select and fund the most impactful projects, direct access to carbon credits for companies still in the process of reducing their own emissions. So we are giving to some sectors the margin to have more time to reduce their emissions and being able to compensate in the meantime. Promotion, measurement, and possible valuation of other environmental services, traceability of those carbon credits, avoiding double counting, and the sharing and promotion of best practices among participants. Finally, just to sum up, we would want to highlight that this kind of initiatives would contribute to 6 different sustainable development goals. Thank you very much.